are talking The Nun 2, and this of course is a sequel to a spin-off of a sequel. Yes, The Nun 2, directed by Michael Chavez. Now, did this one break the habit of most sequels and be pretty good, or was I having none of it? I know you come here for the amusing puns, I know. Anyway, so yes, this is the sequel to The Nun. And the original Nun I actually kind of liked, which was that controversial opinion, but I kind of enjoyed it. I gave it a kind of a 6 out of 10. Most people really didn't like the original Nun, but I quite enjoyed it. How did I feel about the sequel? Now this picks up sometime after, obviously, the first Nun spin-off movie, and Taissa Farmiga's Nun, good Nun so to speak, is obviously now just in a convent. She's now friends with Storm Reed's character, who is kind of a novice nun. And we learn that there has been a variety of strange deaths involving clergy that is kind of sweeping across the globe. And the Vatican, the Church, feels it's related to the demon, obviously, from that comes in the impression of a nun. So Taissa Farmiga is sent to basically investigate it, and we find out, yes, Valak has returned. It wasn't destroyed at the end of the original Nun movie, as we know, because we've seen that in the Conjuring 2, which is actually after this movie. And yeah, Storm Reed's character kind of goes in tow, and essentially it kind of plays a little bit like a spooky Indiana Jones movie, I would say. It's kind of like tracking down this kind of artifact and then having this kind of confrontation. Anyway, so let's discuss it. Now, one interesting aspect before we get into what I liked and didn't like, Bonnie Aaran, who plays the actual character of Valak, the nun, is suing Warner Brothers because she feels like she's not getting paid enough. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is the last time we actually see Bonnie Aaran as the nun, Valak. We'll see how that ends up, but because obviously the actual original nun character in Conjuring 2 was actually made in reshoots. The original Conjuring 2 actually had a different style, more traditional looking demon in the Conjuring 2, and it was only in reshoots that they decided to change that to the nun character. So there you go. Anyway, what did I like about this movie? There's one really big thing I really enjoyed about this movie, which I feel is something I've talked about in many other reviews. And yes, we know that there's been plenty of other kind of nun-related low-budget horror, but I'm talking about possession movies, really. One question I've mentioned in a few possession movies is, like, what is the MO of a demon? Why do they, in possession movies, why does a demon actually want to take, possession of someone? What is it actually its end game? What does it want to end up with? I mean, it just seems to me that in possession movies, a demon ends up possessing some poor schmuck. They start acting all weird, end up getting tied to a bed, and then they get exorcised. So that always seems to be the way that kind of like possession movies and kind of demon movies end up going. I always think, well, what was the actual aim of this demon? What did it actually want to achieve? This film, yes, we actually have a possession, which tends to be the majority of this film, with an actual purpose. There is actually, we have a demon possessing someone with an actual purpose in mind. And I quite like the way this possession is actually quite different to other possession movies. Like the person who's possessed doesn't even realise they're being possessed. And at the front of it is kind of acting normal quite often, but then the possession kind of takes over, and the Valak character, the demon, actually is trying to achieve something. So I thought that was, it might seem relatively minor, but it gave, okay, there's actually a reason why this kind of entity is doing this, and it actually has an end game. As I've mentioned, it's kind of like a MacGuffin in this movie, which I won't really talk too much about, but I appreciate the fact that we have this kind of this motivation, at least, for this kind of demonic character, which I always question. What is the motivation of these kind of entities. Anyway, so that was quite good. And as I say, it kind of plays like a spooky Indiana Jones. Taissa Farmiga's character, Sister Irene, for the first 2 acts of the movie, isn't actually in direct conflict with the Valak. She's kind of like trying to find where this kind of nun is headed, you know, where this kind of demonic entity is going, and tracking it down, finding clues about what it potentially wants and how to kind of defeat it and things like that. So we have kind of Taissa Farmiga's character along with Storm Reeve's character in pursuit of the nun for like 2/3 of the movie. And then, you know, we have this possessed person really kind of like acting as our sort of unwitting antagonist for much of the time. So there's some pretty good scares. I always think that the character of Valak looks pretty, you know, pretty iconic at this point. This is obviously why Bonnie Aaron is trying to sue Warner Brothers, but there's some, you know, some great kind of like sequences involving some pretty good scares. There's lots of kind of jump scares. Cinematography is a little overdone, but looks kind of like you know, very stylized, stuff like that. And I think the story probably is a little more compelling than the original Nun, to be honest with you. So for me, I found it kind of the kind of pursuit of Valak went on a little long for me. I just thought they kind of saved it for the finale, when I did think it could have been a little, you know, integrated a little sooner, because they felt a little bit too kind of separate. I felt in many ways. I mentioned I like the cinematography here, but then and the kind of like the settings. But I have to say, to be honest with you, this movie kind of looks like a comic book film. And this is one aspect where I think the first one was better, if you ask me. The first one had this great dripping with atmosphere, kind of like, you know, spooky vibes just coming from the, you know, this out of the way monastery in kind of Romania. Yes, I know it was kind of somewhat stylized, but if you look at this movie compared to, say, the Conjuring movies, this one looks just looks too over stylized. So we have these sequences, obviously in France, it being set in France, and we have Taissa Farmiga's character kind of wandering around the streets of this French kind of city, and it looks too over stylized to me. That the actual kind of architecture looks like set to me. It doesn't look real, and there's no pedestrians. It gives it this kind of like comic book feel to it, I would say. It looks too over stylized. You know, there's never anyone walking around in sequences where there's something supposed to be happening, yet we see kind of like external shots where there's massive like bustling traffic. I mean, this is meant to be set in the 1950s, but you'd think it was the 1850s in the way that these kind of these sequences are sometimes constructed. Like no one ever turns on a kind of like an electric light. It just makes it feel like this is the 1950s. We're not, you know, we're not in the dark ages at this point. There's actually, you know, it's relatively kind of like modern history. Why are people walking around in dark rooms and things like this? And it's just like no one attempts it. It just gives it this like silly kind of like stylized kind of feel to it, which I feel. You compare this to the Conjuring movies, and it doesn't feel like it's from the same universe. I mean, that was, I would say, you felt like it was kind of set in our reality to a degree. And now I know the original Nun was still sort of somewhat kind of like over stylized, but you got the impression with that one, I feel, because it was such a kind of like out of way setting. It was in Romania, in the kind of like out in the kind of like the wilderness somewhere. This kind of lone kind of like convent. And that's why it was kind of so gothic looking and so kind of isolated looking. I get that, but here we're meant to believe this is in certain sequences we have this like, you know, this kind of French city with like no one walking around in it, and these kind of like fake looking kind of like streets. It is like a set, and then even when we have internal sequences, again they look like sets a lot of the time. I just didn't. He just gave it this kind of like this unrealistic like comic booky feel to a certain degree. I also think it's trying to repeat beats from kind of the original Nun movie, and obviously the Conjuring film with Valak would appear, the Conjuring 2, by having these kind of like let's have this moment where the nun appears. And speaking of the nun, I have to be honest with you, there's a little disappointed that the nun character itself is actually not in the movie as much as I would have liked. I mean, for the most part, the character of Valak is a possessed person not the Nun. It's just like, nah, I wanted to see the Nun. It's kind of why I came here. And it feels like they're kind of like saving the Nun character as a kind of like a surprise at the end. There's a kind of like a thing that we have to wait and see. But at this point, we know what the Nun looks like. It strikes me as like, oh yeah, well, we've seen like a possessed guy who, to be honest, who's just like a sweaty bloke, walking around. It's like, yeah, cool. But like, I enjoyed some of the aspects of the possession in regards to how that was set up. But, it's like, at this point, the Valak is pretty well established. Why are we kind of like hiding it until right at the end? We get a few kind of flashes here and there, but it just seems like an odd choice. I didn't really feel like we got as much of the actual Nun character in this movie as one would kind of expect. Perhaps you could argue that this is because of the fact that this movie is a sequel, but I found the characterization here paper thin. Taissa Farmiga's character, Sister Irene, just seems to be a blank expression going from one MacGuffin chase to the next, and I think the actresses do a good job in both the roles as the two kind of nuns and Maurice as our kind of other returning character. But I think the movie assumes that, we've done the characterization, so that don't need to do that anymore, because these characters are barely characters at all, I would say. Although, let's just say, I think the actors do the best what they can in this kind of situation. It ends up being a bit of a MacGuffin chase, as I've mentioned. So, although I appreciate the difference in storytelling, again, it feels very much like, basic kind of storytelling 101. So, it's a pretty good movie. I didn't think it was outstanding in any particular way. I mean, I think the general census is this movie is better than the original Nun movie. I have to be honest with you, personally, I still prefer the original Nun movie, although I do think this has some more interesting elements to it, to a degree. So I'm actually going to give it the same score as I gave the original Nun, which was 6 out of 10. I probably would critically say this is, I think, maybe better in some ways, but I personally preferred just slightly maybe the original Nun, because I just felt it was a little bit more atmospheric. But I'll give it a 6, like I said. So have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.